Hey guys, we are wrapping up our coverage of the Amazing Race 35 by a team ranking. So in this video, I'll be ranking all 13 teams based off the races that they ran during this season. And this was definitely a wonky list. There were definitely some really weird teams and really weird track records to get into, but I'll get into that more in a moment. But there are 13 teams to break down here, and unless I'm wasting any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 13, the team that I believe ran the worst race on the season was actually pretty close. I did debate this quite a bit. However, after thinking about it, I did decide to go with Alexandra and Sheridan, the first boots of the season. And again, it was tough, as I feel like they're probably not the worst team in the grand scheme of things, and they actually were not in last place for a lot of the leg. They actually got up to 9th place at one point, which obviously was a big factor. And obviously they were 11th place coming into the detour, but they still chose the wrong detour that caused them to lose a lot of time there as the other teams were able to pass them, as you literally had Elizabeth and Elana literally having to wait at the massage place to do that detour, and they're still able to finish before Alexander and Sheridan. That causes them to fall all the way to last place there. Again, it was pretty close, but I did decide at the end of the day that they were the first boots. They were still in the back of the pack for a lot of the race. And in general, I find their race not too impressive, which is why they're here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have a team that I literally just mentioned, and here we have Elizabeth and Ileana. And again, it was pretty close between these two. I find them to be a pretty messy team. They were actually behind Alexander and Sheridan during leg 1 coming into the detour, but they were able to pass them due to them choosing the better detour, though even then they still had to wait, which I think speaks more to Alexander and Sheridan's mistakes. So I think that was one reason I had them above them. Also the fact that they do technically outlast them by one leg, even though they were second to last in leg 1. And I think leg 2 was obviously not great either, where they did choose one detour, but they do get a bit unlucky that their taxi ended up taking them to the other detour instead, which could have caused them to fall behind. But at the end of the day, I still find them to be a mostly mediocre team, one that I probably don't have too much faith in the grand scheme of the Amazing Race. But again, they did technically outlast the other team by one leg, which was enough to have them here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have a team that made it a bit further in the race, but I find their run to be mostly mediocre, and here we have Liam and Yeremy. And again, they seem like pretty likable people. They obviously have a very interesting story, and obviously they make it further than some teams we'll be talking about soon. But still, their race was pretty terrible, where again, they get out to a rocky start with 2 8th place finishes in a row. They then get saved in leg 3 by the fact that it was a mega leg, where they were the last team to arrive at the pit stop during the first half of that leg. Had it been a normal leg, they would have been eliminated. But due to the format of that leg, they're able to keep racing, and they are able to eventually pass some other teams to get a 6th place finish there. But then they're right back at the bottom where they get another 8th place finish, and then they're eliminated the next leg, coming in 9th place. Again, it's mostly a mediocre race, and there's not too much upside to it, despite the fact that they make it further than some other teams that we'll be talking about in a moment, which is why they're here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and I feel like these next two teams are extremely rocky, and it was kind of hard to assess them as well. However, at number 10, I actually decided to go with the team that made it further than the other team, and here we have Andrea and Molina. And again, Andrea and Molina do have some longevity to them. They do make it all the way to the final 8, but I still find their run mostly mediocre, where in leg 1, they get a 10th place finish despite being on the first flight out. They should have had a pretty big advantage there, but they end up fumbling the detour that causes them to fall all the way to there. They get another 10th place finish immediately afterwards, which isn't great. They do get a 7th place finish during the mega leg, but even then they were still around the 9 to 11 spot for a lot of that, and it really wasn't until the last roadblock where they were able to truly catch up there, so I don't find that impressive. They do follow it up with 2 okay rounds, getting a 4th place finish in leg 5 and a 6th place finish in leg 6. But then we get to their boot round, which is just really bad. They fall really far behind to the point where Phil has to come out to them in the middle of the course and eliminate them right then and there. So again, on the whole, while they do make it further than some other teams, I find their run mostly mediocre. I find that they were prone to a lot of mistakes, and there's just a lot of rockiness across their race to where I don't find it as impressive, and because of that, I do have them here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have a team pretty similar to Andrea and Molina, but I do find them run slightly more impressive, and here we have Joe and Ian. And again, their run was also pretty rocky, and obviously they were eliminated earlier than Andrea Molina, but I find their highs slightly more impressive than Andrea Molina's. We're in leg one. Yes, they do get a ninth place finish, only one spot above Andrea Molina, but they were also on the second flight. So obviously they had a disadvantage, but they were still able to catch up to a degree, though obviously they still don't do that great on the detour there. Leg two, they are in the middle of the pack for a lot of it. They're able to snag a seventh place finish there. Then we get to the mega leg, where admittedly a lot of their run is just kind of fine. They're in the middle of the pack for a lot of it, but they are able to do pretty well on the roadblock, where they're able to get a fourth place finish by the end of that. And then we get to their boot round, which admittedly is pretty bad, where they are the first team to arrive at the roadblock, but they do so poorly at it that they fall all the way to 8th place, and they're kind of in the back of the pack for a lot of it. Mind you, they were not the last team to finish the detour. They were second to last there. It's more so they get outpaced by Morgan and Lena on the way to the pit stop that causes their elimination. So even then, I find their actual downfall more impressive than Andrea Molina's, to where they just were so far behind they had no shot of ever catching up. Joe and Ian were much closer to staying, where it was literally just a race to the pit stop there, and they just get edged out due to Morgan and Lena having the better taxi. So I do find that a bit more impressive than Andrea Molina, and that's a big reason they are above them, despite them being earlier boots. But at the end of the day, they're still a pretty rocky team, and because of that, they're here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have the earliest boot left to talk about, and here we have Joselyn and Victor. And they were a very dominant team early on. They won the first 2 legs of the season, and plus, outside the very start of the race, they were never outside of the top 5. In fact, during leg 2, they were in first place the entire time. So I feel like on the team ranking, I can't really ignore that. They were just so dominant across that early stretch. But then we get to the mega leg, where it does start to fall apart, where obviously they don't do that great on the boat challenge. And then even moving forward on the first detour, they do fall to second to last. But to be fair, they were second to last to the pit stop halfway through the mega leg, where had it been a normal leg, they would have survived that round. But obviously, due to them having to keep racing, they don't really have much of a chance to catch up. That causes them to eventually fall behind, eventually becoming the boots by the end of it. So even then, even in their boot round, while their collapse is pretty bad, they do get a bit unlucky by the fact that it was a mega leg, and through that there wasn't more opportunities for them to catch up through equalizers or additional tasks there. So I do think that also helps them out on the team ranking to a degree, as I feel like their track record there is much more impressive than any of the teams we've already talked about. But at the end of the day, they're still only the 3rd boots of the season, and I can't really ignore that, which is why I do have them here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and from this point on, we do have the final 7, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 7, I did decide to go with Robin and Chelsea. And I actually debated between them and Joselyn and Victor, as I feel like Robin and Chelsea are another very rocky team for a lot of the race, where leg 1, they get 11th place, which isn't particularly great. Leg 2 isn't much better, where they literally get second to last and they're in the back of the pack for a lot of it. They do win the mega leg, but even that was kind of a fluky circumstance, as they were pretty much around the 5 to 6 spot for a lot of that leg. And it really just came down to that final roadblock, where they got really lucky, where they were able to find a match relatively quickly, catapulting them past the other teams and just winning by accident, basically. And then they just kind of fall back to earth for the next few legs, where they fall from 1st to 7th in the following leg, which isn't great. They then get second to last again, which also is not great. However, they do rebound in the following leg, where they do get a 2nd place finish, where they are able to catapult a bunch of teams on their way to the carnival in that leg, which is fine. But then after that, they fall back to 5th place, which again is not great. And then they're eliminated right thereafter, where they are in last place for most of the leg. I think for the most part, they're a very inconsistent team, where for a lot of it, they're just kind of in the middle of the road. But then there are points where they're just barely surviving. And then there are other points where they get some lucky breaks and they're able to be in the front of the pack. So on the whole, it was a very tough race to assess. However, again, they do have some longevity, and they do at least win a leg, and they get another 2nd place finish, which was enough to have them above Joselyn and Victor in my eyes. But at the end of the day, I find them really hard to assess, which is why they're here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this was another team that was very hard to assess. However, I find their highs slightly more impressive than Robin and Chelsea's, and here we have Morgan and Lena. And they were another team that was really hard to assess, where again, they do have some solid finishes. They do start off the race pretty well, getting 2 4th place finishes in a row. They're also able to win the express pass during leg 1, which is good. But then they kind of fall apart during the mega leg. I do think they misuse their express pass to get out of the boat task, but even then they're unable to get through first place consistently, where right after using the express pass, they fall to second place during a detour. They struggle during that detour, and then they get to 6th place coming into the midway point of the mega leg, which obviously isn't great. A big misuse of the express pass. And then the second half of the mega leg's even worse, where they're falling to second to last, and they're not in a good spot there. The following leg is not great either, where they barely survived that round, where it essentially comes down to a race between them and Joe and Ian to the pit stop, where they had finished the detour after them. So they very easily could have been eliminated there, but they're able to etch them out, so whatever. They are able to recover the following leg, getting a 4th place finish there, which is good, but then they slide to 6th place there, where they actually were the first team to finish the roadblock in that leg, but they fall to 6th place on the way to the carnival, and they kind of just sit in 6th place for the rest of the leg, which I find kind of weird. And then after that, they're eliminated, where they actually managed to finish the detour in 4th place out of 7, and in a spot where Steve and Anna Lee had fallen way far behind there, but due to them and the other teams getting lost on the way to the pit stop, they fall all the way to 7th place, and they get edged out by Steve and Anna Lee. Again, kind of a close finish, but at the end of the day, they were already saved by a close finish, so I think it kind of evens out. In a lot of ways, their race is somewhat similar to Robin and Chelsea's, where they have very similar average placements. Robin and Chelsea actually have a slightly better average placement of 6.22 versus 6.25 for Morgan and Lena. And obviously, Robin and Chelsea win a leg and get another 2nd place finish. But as I explained earlier, I find those situations kind of fluky. But on the whole, I think Morgan and Lena were slightly more consistent as racers. They obviously had a stronger start than Robin and Chelsea. They were even able to get the express pass, and while they didn't use it well, I still find them to be better racers than Robin and Chelsea across the season. And I think with those factors, it was enough to edge them out over them, even though they're relatively close. But because of that, I do have them here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this team is actually somewhat inconsistent when you really look at their race, but they do have some notable highs, and here we have Steve and Anna Lee. And obviously they get all the way to 4th place, but I feel like they get off to a pretty unremarkable start, getting 2 6th place finishes in a row, and it's not until the mega leg where they are able to jump out in front, getting 1st place midway through that, and they are able to remain in 1st place during the second half of the mega leg. It's not until the tail end where they do fall to 2nd place, but still a very strong finish there. They then win the following leg, which is pretty good. However, it also paints a target on their back to where at the following leg, they get U-turned, and they actually did relatively well at the U-turn. However, they did have to turn around due to them messing it up, and they do fall to 7th place at the end of that leg, which obviously isn't great, but obviously they get U-turns, so there's that. At the following leg, they do recover to a degree, but they're still kind of middle of the road, getting a 5th place finish. And then we get to leg 8, which is extremely bad for them, where they get lost on the way to the roadblock, falling to last place. You obviously have them going for the express pass, even though there was a sign that it had already been taken. And they just fall really far behind to the point where they should have been going home. They were in a very bad situation, but they are able to recover. They are able to eventually catch up to the other teams. Now, mind you, I think some of that is due to the other teams like being slow on the way to the pit stop that gave them extra time to catch up, but they still are able to recover and get through another leg. They do fine enough on the following leg, getting a 3rd place finish. We then get to the final 5, where they are technically second to last, but at the end of the day, Todd and Ashley were very much behind the rest of the team, so I don't fault them too much for that. And then they're obviously eliminated at the final 4. So I think on the whole, there are definitely some highs to their game. They obviously win a leg across the season. 2, if you want to count the first half of the mega leg. They obviously get kind of screwed over by the fact that there's a U-turn, and obviously they get targeted there. And obviously there's the fact that they survived that leg where they were in last place. But along the way, there are plenty of mistakes. Like, again, the fact that they were in last place during that leg. The fact that they went for the U-turn despite there clearly being a sign that it had already been taken. And even outside of that, they have some middle-of-the-road finishes outside of that. But they still managed to get all the way to the final 4, which I do have to take into account to a degree. But I feel like compared to the teams that we'll be talking about soon, they're not quite as consistent in my eyes, which is why they're here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have another very interesting team to get into here, but we actually have the runners-up of the season, and here we have Joel and Garrett. And obviously they do get second place, and they actually came relatively close to winning, where obviously they finished the final task not far behind Greg and John, and they came close to winning because of that. So you do have to factor that in. But I think if we're looking at the rest of their race, it is pretty inconsistent, where they do get out to a rocky start, getting a 7th place finish in leg 1. Leg 2, they get a 9th place finish. That's not particularly great. We then get to the mega leg, where they actually do pretty well for most of it. They are in the top 2 for most of it, but they do struggle on that final roadblock that causes them to fall to 9th place. So again, not particularly great. But I think after that, they recover pretty nicely, getting 2 3rd place finishes in a row over the next 2 legs, which I find pretty good. But then they fall to second to last during leg 7. And while they weren't in serious danger, as that was the leg where Andrea Molina fell way far behind, I still hold that as a knock to their game. But then they followed up with a 4th place finish in leg 8. During leg 9, they are able to get a 2nd place finish, which I find pretty impressive there. And then they win the final 5 leg, the only leg that they end up winning across the season, which again, if they ended up winning the season, I actually would knock that a good amount. The fact that they only won 1 leg across the season is not great. And then at the final 4, they do get second to last, which obviously is not good there. And I think the final leg, they actually do pretty well, where it was between them and Rob and Cory for a lot of that leg, where they were in the top 2 spots there. And they were even the first team to arrive at the final task, where they had a decent opportunity to win the race there, though obviously they fall behind to Greg and John. And while they are able to compete with them on the way to the finish line, it just wasn't enough, and they do end up losing the race there. So obviously it's a pretty tough race to assess, where on one hand, they do come relatively close to winning, and I find their end stretch somewhat impressive. But I find their earlier race to be kind of lackluster, where there were plenty of points where they were ahead, plenty of points where they were in the back of the pack. They were second to last a couple of times, which I don't like. And I feel like had they won, they would not be an overly impressive team, where their average placement was only 4.33. And I feel like plenty of other teams in Amazing Race history have been more dominant on their winning seasons than Joel and Garrett had they won. But still, they were still a good enough team to be this high on the list, and because of that, they're here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have a team that I was strangely high on for a lot of the season, and here we have Todd and Ashley. And I know that I got some heat for having them high on my power ranking for a lot of the season. I'll admit that I probably should not have done that as much. But I think if we are looking at their race, I find a lot of it somewhat decent, where early on they are in the middle of the pack, like getting like 2 5th place finishes in a row, but they are able to turn it up during the mega leg, where they are able to notch a 3rd place finish there. They then follow it up with 2 more 5th place finishes, which I find pretty impressive. And then we get to leg 7, where they get another 3rd place finish. And then the following leg, they get a 2nd place finish, where they were actually in 1st place at the end of the detour, but they do get edged out by Greg and John on the way to the pit stop. But I still find that somewhat impressive. So I feel like for a lot of the race, they actually managed to be pretty consistent, where they are consistently in the top half of the group, which I feel like is a big reason why I find their race a bit more impressive than Joel and Garrett, who had a bit more rockiness during a lot of this stage. But I do feel like around the final 6, they do fall apart, where at the final 6, they are second to last. They obviously fall behind there, and they're pretty blatantly eliminated at the final 5. So again, they do kind of collapse by the end of it. But I feel like for most of their race, they were more consistent than Joel and Garrett. They have an average placement of 4.20, despite them being in 5th place, which again is more impressive than Joel and Garrett. So obviously this will be a bit controversial, considering that Joel and Garrett almost won the race. But Joel and Garrett also had more points, where they were second to last compared to Todd and Ashley, which is a big reason I had them here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously these top 2 teams made it to the final leg, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, I did decide to go with Rob and Cory, and obviously Rob and Cory did finish in last place in the final leg, which obviously, considering that Joel and Garrett were closer to winning, I do find that kind of bad. But again, I feel like if we are looking at the rest of the race, I find Rob and Cory's resume more impressive, where they get out to a very strong start, being in second place for the first two legs, kind of being right behind Joselyn and Victor. We then get to the mega leg where they manage to get third place in the first half. And while they do stumble a bit in the second half, they still are able to run away with a fifth place finish there. Leg 5 is pretty wonky, where they struggle a lot on the roadblock. That's the one where they're balancing the pot on their head. They fall all the way to last place, which is pretty bad, but they are actually able to recover on the detour, where they're still able to snag a 6th place finish out of 10, which is pretty good. And then the following leg, they're able to jump all the way back to second place, so they're able to recover pretty well over that rocky stretch. And I think from there on out, they're kind of in the middle of the pack, but not really dominant. We're obviously at the final 7, they get a 3rd place finish. Mind you, that's the leg where they go for the express pass, but still, it's still worth mentioning. At the final 6, they get a 4th place finish, which isn't great. We then get to the final 5, where they use the express pass, but still fail to win the leg, only getting a 3rd place finish, which is not great, obviously. And then they do win the final 4 leg, the only leg they win across the season, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But again, I feel like compared to Joel and Garrett, they were more consistent earlier on in the race, which is why I had them higher. And then obviously they're the last team to cross the finish line, which isn't great. But for a lot of the leg, like, it was between them and Joel and Garrett, while Greg and John were behind. And it really wasn't until the end of the race where they do fall to 3rd place. So obviously that's something worth considering. So on the whole, I do find the race to be somewhat consistent, where even though they're not the most dominant team in the world, like, they still are able to remain out of danger for most of the race. And again, compared to Joel and Garrett, I find their results to be more consistent, where they have an average placement of 3.17, which is pretty good. But again, I feel like there's a pretty clear number 1 team, which is why they're here at number 2. And now at number 1, the team that I believe ran the best race on the season is Greg and John. And first up, I'll just say it, I was completely shocked that they ended up winning the race. Where even though they were the most dominant team on the season, I felt like with the edit focusing so much on their mistakes and the fact that they were the team to beat, that I felt like it was just going to lead to them coming up short by the end of it. But no, they ended up winning, believe it or not. And to be fair, I still would have had them at number 1 even if they lost the race, as I feel like they have by far the best track record. However, they still are not without their flaws, where they do start off the race with 2 3rd place finishes in a row. Mind you, that first leg had some wonkiness with them falling to 6th place after their flight there, and they kind of had to fight their way back to 3rd place, but they still get it by the end of it. But then we get to the mega leg, which I feel like is the biggest knock to their race, where they struggle a lot during the boat challenge. They end up falling behind to 10th place by the time with the detour, and while they do recover a bit, they are in 8th place by the end of the first half, and they kind of just remain there during the second half of the mega leg, giving them an 8th place finish. So obviously that's not great. That's obviously a pretty rocky stretch. But I think they recover extremely well for that, where from that point on, they never finish below 2nd place. They get a 2nd place finish in the following leg, leg 5. They then win the next 4 legs in a row, which is really insane when you think about it. They then get 2 2nd place finishes in a row, and then they obviously win the final leg. And while they do make some mistakes along the way, mistakes that are highlighted in the edit, it obviously does not come back to bite them in any tangible way. But I think the biggest knock is their final leg, where they do struggle a lot on that. They are in last place for a lot of it, where a lot of it seems to be this battle between Joel and Garrett and Rob and Cory. They're kind of just fighting from behind, and I think they get some lucky breaks along the way, where for one, Rob and Cory do get lost on the way to the final test that allows them to potentially catch up. And then even then, they barely beat Joel and Garrett, where supposedly that was a very close finish. They very easily could have lost that leg had they just been a little further behind than what they were. So I think to that end, even their win is kind of fluky in some ways. And obviously with some of the mistakes that they made during their race, and not to mention the mega leg, they are a pretty wonky team to assess in the grand scheme of things. But at the end of the day, they are still the most dominant team across the season. They won 4 legs before the final leg. They have an average placement of 2.75, clearly ahead of the next team, Rob and Cory, and they are still a relatively solid team, even though I think in the grand scheme of things, they're probably not the best team in the world. But I think for the season, they were clearly the most dominant team on the season, which is why they're here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of the Amazing Race 35. Thank you for joining me for it. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, there are more shows coming in the future. There's going to be another season of The Amazing Race coming in the spring, so you can look forward to coverage of that. Obviously, Survivor 45 and Survivor UK are shows I'm still covering, so you can expect coverage of those shows. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.